Over the last few years, Australia's economy is acting strange. Real estate pricing are rising enormously. Export is not performing well. In fact, in the last 6 years, Australia's economy, GDP in general, has been constantly falling. The government has started to realize that the country is heavily dependent on all the wrong industries. Industries that have time and time again crippled other economies around the world. They're also heavily dependent on all the wrong partners. They are simultaneously one of, if not the closest modern ally to the USA, while also being almost entirely reliant on resource exports to China. That's a difficult position for any country to be in. As global events continue to change, Australia may face pressure from both of these powerful and unpredictable nations. That alone could be a challenge, but the bigger concern is that this outside pressure might make it harder for Australia to deal with its own problems that have been quietly building over time. So how serious and extensive are these current challenges for Australia? And finally, can they be reasonably addressed without doing more harm than good? Just like some individuals become rich simply because they were lucky, it's easy to argue that a country can end up in a similar situation. Australia is often used as an example of this idea. In many ways, the country has been incredibly fortunate because of its natural resources. Natural resource wealth is a bit like winning the lottery. When you suddenly gain access to huge amounts of valuable resources, it creates amazing opportunities. But just like many lottery winners, that kind of sudden wealth can also be mishandled. Some lottery winners spend carelessly and eventually end up worse off than before. The same risk exists for countries that depend heavily on natural resources. When someone wins the lottery, they may lose motivation to pursue other forms of income because the easy money feels more rewarding and immediate. Natural resources can create a similar effect for a country. If exporting raw materials generates large amounts of money, it can make developing other industries seem less necessary. Australia has not been completely immune to this problem. When we look at Australia's export economy, it becomes clear that our goods exports are not very diverse. A large portion of what we sell to the world comes from raw natural resources such as iron ore, coal, and other minerals, along with agricultural products. In many cases, these materials are exported without being heavily refined or processed within Australia. This creates a potential vulnerability. When an economy depends so much on natural resource exports, it becomes very sensitive to global commodity prices and international trade conditions. If demand falls or trade policies change, the country can feel the impact very quickly. Global trade rules and agreements are constantly shifting, and in recent years there's been increasing discussion about trade protectionism. That kind of global shift could create problems for countries like Australia that rely on exporting large quantities of raw materials. Fortunately, Australia's direct trade relationship with the United States is not extremely large compared to some other countries. In fact, Australia imports more goods from the United States than it exports to it. That means some global trade tensions may not hit Australia as hard as they would hit other export-driven economies. However, a general global movement toward stricter trade barriers would still be bad news overall for Australia. Another challenge is the changing future of some of Australia's biggest exports. Coal, for example, is currently the second largest goods export from Australia. However, global demand for coal is not growing the way it once did. Many countries are moving toward cleaner energy sources because of environmental concerns and technological improvements. Renewable energy is becoming more competitive, which means coal may slowly lose its place in the global energy market. Heavy reliance on natural resources can also create political and economic problems. In some countries, resource wealth leads to corruption because there is so much money available in one concentrated sector. Powerful groups compete to control that wealth, and it can weaken institutions. Australia has avoided the worst of these issues largely because its political institutions and legal systems are strong. These institutions have played a big role in maintaining long-term stability and prosperity. Still, Australia is not perfect in how it manages its resources. One common criticism is that the country has not taxed its natural resources effectively. Ideally, profits from resource extraction should benefit the entire population, since these resources belong to the nation as a whole. There have been attempts to introduce stronger resource taxes in the past, but these proposals often face strong resistance from the mining and energy industries. Lobbying from large corporations made it very difficult for those reforms to succeed. In fact, some policies have moved in the opposite direction. In recent years, the government has provided large subsidies and tax benefits to parts of the natural gas industry. In one recent year alone, these benefits totaled close to $15 billion. Supporters of these subsidies argue that they help maintain energy supply and economic activity. However, critics point out that Australians have sometimes ended up buying back their own exported gas from international markets at higher prices. This situation has been widely criticized as inefficient and poorly managed. Another major issue in Australia is housing. Real estate prices in several Australian cities have become extremely high. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne consistently rank among the least affordable housing markets in the world. There are many reasons why housing has become so expensive, and unfortunately, the problem has been difficult to solve. One reason is immigration. Australia has long been an attractive destination for people from around the world. The country offers relatively high wages, strong public institutions, and a high standard of living. Because of this, Australia has welcomed large numbers of immigrants for many years. Many of these new residents settle in major cities, which increases demand for housing in those areas. In addition to regular migrants, Australia also attracts wealthy individuals from other countries who want to invest or live in a stable and desirable place. Australian cities regularly rank among the most livable in the world, which makes them appealing to international buyers. To address concerns about foreign buyers pushing up property prices, the government recently introduced a temporary ban on foreign property purchases for 2 years. At first glance, this policy might seem like a strong step toward reducing housing demand. However, foreign buyers actually represent a relatively small percentage of total housing purchases. The policy also does not apply to people who are living in Australia on residency or certain visa programs, which means much of the demand still remains. One area where this becomes especially complicated is international education. Australia has built a huge industry around attracting foreign students. Education services are actually one of the country's largest exports. Unlike physical goods, service exports are harder to see. When iron ore is loaded onto ships and sent overseas, it's easy to imagine the export. But when a student from another country comes to Australia and pays tuition fees, that money also counts as an export because it flows into the Australian economy. Tourism is another example of a service export. When visitors travel to Australia and spend money on hotels, food, and entertainment, economists count that spending as an export because the money is coming from foreign visitors. Education has become a particularly large part of this service economy. Universities and colleges rely heavily on international student fees. Many foreign students come to Australia for legitimate education opportunities, but some also see student visas as a pathway into the Australian housing market or job market. In the past, there were even cases of so-called diploma mills. These were institutions that provided very low quality or even fake courses, mainly to allow people to obtain student visas. The government has taken steps to crack down on these operations, but the broader system still depends heavily on international students as a source of income. Housing demand is also fueled by tax policies that strongly encourage property investment. Australia's tax system allows investors to offset property losses against their taxable income, a practice known as negative gearing. Combined with capital gains tax discounts, these policies make property investment very attractive for higher income individuals. As a result, many Australians view owning investment properties as a standard financial strategy. In fact, some financial advisors even suggest that it is irresponsible not to invest in property if you have the means to do so. This has encouraged people to take on large amounts of debt to buy real estate. Because of this, Australian households carry extremely high levels of debt. In fact, Australia has one of the highest levels of household debt in the world, second only to Switzerland. While government debt in Australia looks relatively modest compared to many other developed countries, the amount of money owed by individual households is very large. Another factor pushing people toward homeownership is the legal framework around renting. Tenant protections in Australia are relatively weak compared to some other developed countries. Homeowners, on the other hand, often receive stronger legal protections. In some cases, homeowners struggling to pay their mortgage are less likely to lose their homes than renters who fall behind on rent payments. Housing also plays a major role in retirement planning. Because housing is so expensive, many Australians believe they must own a home outright before retirement in order to live comfortably. Government policies aimed at helping first-time homebuyers have sometimes made the situation worse. Programs that provide grants or tax benefits for new buyers effectively increase purchasing power. But when many buyers suddenly have more money available, housing prices often rise accordingly. If every buyer receives an additional $100,000 in assistance, prices can quickly adjust upward by roughly the same amount. Income levels also influence housing demand. Australia has relatively high wages compared to many other countries. Minimum wage laws are strong, and enforcement is generally good. However, Australia does not have the extremely high salaries found in places like Silicon Valley or New York for top professionals. That means the demand for expensive housing in cities like Sydney is not always coming from extremely wealthy individuals earning massive salaries. Instead, it comes from a combination of immigration, tax incentives, and people stretching their finances to enter the housing market. On the supply side, building more housing has also proven difficult. Australia has a large amount of land, but most people want to live in a small number of major cities. In many rural areas, housing is actually quite affordable, but job opportunities and infrastructure are concentrated in urban centers. Urban planning regulations, zoning laws, and infrastructure limitations all make it harder to increase housing supply quickly. Expanding cities outward has created urban sprawl, but building upward with higher density housing often faces political resistance. There are also financial incentives that discourage change. State governments rely heavily on a tax called stamp duty, which is paid whenever property is purchased. In some cases, stamp duty can be more than 6% of the purchase price. As property prices rise, this tax generates huge amounts of revenue for state governments. However, stamp duty also discourages people from selling their homes because they know they will have to pay the tax again when buying another property. This means many people hold on to larger homes even after their children move out, reducing the number of family-size houses available for younger buyers. Construction costs also play a role. Building homes in Australia is expensive partly because labor costs are high. Skilled tradespeople can earn very high wages, especially in industries like mining, where remote work sites offer extremely lucrative salaries. As a result, residential construction sometimes competes with large mining companies for skilled workers. All of these factors combine to create a complicated housing crisis. But it's important to remember that many of these problems exist partly because Australia has been successful. The country offers high wages, stability, and a strong quality of life, which attracts people from around the world. Australia also performs relatively well in terms of wealth distribution compared to many other developed economies. While income inequality exists, wealth inequality is not as extreme as in some countries. One reason is that many Australians own homes, which means a large portion of the population holds significant assets. Another factor is Australia's mandatory retirement savings system, known as superannuation. Employers are required to contribute a portion of workers' wages into retirement funds. Over time, this builds a broad base of financial assets across the population. However, these systems also create generational tensions. Younger Australians often face higher taxes and higher housing costs compared to older generations who entered the housing market decades earlier. Studies have shown that younger working Australians can end up paying significantly more tax than retirees earning similar incomes. Despite these challenges, Australia still has many tools available to address its problems. The country remains wealthy, politically stable, and resource-rich. The real question is not whether solutions exist, but whether there is enough political will to implement them. During elections, political parties frequently promise major reforms to fix issues like housing affordability and economic diversification. Whether those promises will lead to real change remains to be seen. Let me know your thoughts in the comment below and make sure to subscribe for our next interesting video coming soon. This is Rob, and you are watching Beyond Economy.